Hello, everybody. Good evening and welcome. My name is Dr. Ray Ward. I'm the director of the Wolfenden Center for Civic Engagement here at Cabrini University. And on behalf of Cabrini University and the League of Women Voters, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's virtual panel, Judging Pennsylvania's Courts. Tonight, we're going to be discussing Pennsylvania's court system and some impactful proposed reforms with three special guests. Before I introduce them, just as a note, the third branch of government and Pennsylvania's judiciary system in particular has been in the spotlight politically. If you want to look back to the 2018 PA Supreme Court gerrymandering decision or 2020's election conduct rulings, the judiciary is obviously more important than ever. Early this year, HB 38 proposed a constitutional amendment that would change how judges are elected in the state, moving from statewide to regional elections. That's going to be part of our focus in the discussion tonight. To unpack some of this, we have Roberta Winters, Tuan Samahon, and Jamie Mogul here with us tonight. Roberta is the president of the League of Women Voters of Radnor Township. After devoting her life for 35 years to teaching and molding young minds, she has joined the League of Women Voters in working on their nonpartisan civic engagement work with a special focus on voter engagement, voter turnout, and countering any kind of voter suppression work on that. The League of Women Voters have been a tremendous partner of Cabrini University, particularly in our last voter turnout work in 2020. I'm really grateful to Roberta for the shot in the arm that she gives to people and making sure that they take responsibility for the democracy that they live in. Jamie Mogil is an attorney in private practice and voter services chair of the League of Women Voters. She was part of the Common Cause PA effort in the 2018 PA election protection effort as their director. And she recently helped pass the state's first voting reforms in 80 years, including the no excuse absentee voting and Pennsylvania voter machines audible paper trail. Jamie, thank you for being with us as well. And finally, Professor Tuan Samahon of the Charles Widger School of Law at Villanova University joins us as well. A 2017 Fulbright scholar, Professor Samahon has published in judicial selection in a number of journals and has worked to interpret and fashion federal constitutional law, including testifying before state judiciary committees, the subcommittee on the Constitution, and serving as counsel in Separation of Powers and Freedom of Information Act litigation in federal trial and appellate courts. Can you please join me in welcoming Roberta, Tuan, and Jamie? And our panelists aren't going to be able to hear the rousing round of applause right now, but please know that you are welcomed heartily to this conversation. And I'd like to hand it over first to Roberta, who's going to give us an overview of the judiciary in Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to do some switching here so you can see my screen because I'm an elementary teacher and I know that you need pictures to work on this. And I believe we should now have a nice picture coming up. Can you see it? Yes? Good. Here
Yes.
are Pennsylvania courts. And if you check the diagram, you will see we have a unified court system. And you start at the bottom in the minor courts, and you work your way up through the Court of Common Pleas and then to the appellate courts, which you can see have fewer judges and have greater responsibility in terms of their decision making. So if you look at the judicial system in Pennsylvania, which you just saw, and we'll look at it again, the number of courts that we have and the judges are established by two different things. One is the Pennsylvania Constitution, as specified in Article 5, and then there are laws that also impact the judicial system that are passed by the Pennsylvania General Assembly. One of the interesting things about electing and selecting judges in Pennsylvania at various levels is that they, first of all, have to be a Pennsylvania resident. They have to be a U.S. citizen and a member of the Bar Association, unless they're magisterial district judges, which are at the lowest level of that triangle. Once elected, and again, other than the magisterial district judges, they serve an unlimited number of 10-year terms. they also have to retire when they're 75 years old. Well, of course, when you have to retire at 75, there can always be vacancies. So those vacancies are filled by the governor with the approval of the Pennsylvania Senate. And as you can probably tell, this was somewhat mirrored after what's happened with the federal judicial system. One of the unusual things about the elections of judges in Pennsylvania is that all the election and retention elections are held an odd number of years. And this is very odd. In fact, we're the only state in the United States that elects judges on the odd number of years. And this is because, for whatever reason, we've decided when our voter turnout is the lowest, that's when we need to elect the judges. So when the voter turnout tends to be the least in the Commonwealth, we elect judges in two types of elections. The first are partisan elections. And again, a partisan election means that a judge who's running as a candidate for the judicial office must be registered as a Democrat or a Republican and seek the endorsement of that party. And during these partisan elections, this happens, first of all, in the primary elections, which are closed in Pennsylvania. That means you have to be either a Republican or a Democrat to vote on the candidates in the primary election. That automatically eliminates many voters who are independent from actually serving as voters in this primary election. So once they're chosen in the primary election under a Democrat or Republican ticket, they can then serve as a candidate in the general election, which happens in November. So this primary election in May, which is closed in Pennsylvania, will be a place where partisan election occurs for the initial service of the judges in our Commonwealth. Once they're elected in a general election, they then are put on a ballot every 10 years in the general election after the initial term of office. And at that time, they're not shown to be either Republican or Democrat, but just need to be determined by a yes or no vote if they will continue their service as judges. And again, this is only for every judge except those who serve in magisterial or municipal service, because they are elected every 6 years by partisan ballot. So just think about that. Every 6 years, they have to run as a candidate. And as you know, when you run for a candidate, it takes time, it takes money, it takes effort. So we spend some of our time in our judicial system being served by people who are running for office, particularly in the initial election. Now, the lower courts in Pennsylvania, and these are again the Court of Common Pleas, which is really the primary courts for most major and criminal civil cases, has lots of judges, and minor courts have even more judges. They perform things like, if you have a parking ticket you don't like, or, you had a problem with the cleaner who ruined your clothes, that's where you would go. But these courts, that are the lower courts, are elected by judicial district or region. So that means if you live in Delaware County, you elect people that serve Delaware County, or you may in fact elect somebody smaller, like somebody who actually serves in Lower Merion or in Radnor. So these minor courts are at the service of more local people who know these candidates and elect them if they're in the minor courts every 6 years. But these candidates can cross file in the primary election. So that can be very useful. So if they win in a primary election, they can then basically go unopposed in a general election. So the minor courts includes the magisterial and municipal courts. And actually in Pennsylvania, we have these municipal courts that are specific only to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. So you probably heard like the Philadelphia Traffic Court. That's one of these minor courts. So if you've been there, I'm sorry. Now, the appellate courts in Pennsylvania have the big jobs to do. They make the big decisions. It's not parking tickets. These are things like, how do we draw the district lines? What happens if Lower Merion has a dispute with Radnor over the sewage system? These are the big decisions. So They're chosen by statewide elections. That means everybody in the state chooses these judges. And you can see 7 Supreme Court justices. That's the highest court in the Commonwealth. They make decisions that affect everybody in the state. The Superior Court also hears civil and criminal appeals cases that come from the lower courts. They have 15 judges, and they also make decisions that affect everybody in the state. Again, the Commonwealth Court usually hears those government cases between municipalities, between districts, between state, different counties, and they have 9 judges. These are the people who make the decisions that are the most important in our Commonwealth, and particularly the Supreme Court and Superior Court that make decisions throughout, that last for everybody throughout the Commonwealth. So those are the basic systems in Pennsylvania and how it affects us. I believe you get the sense of our court system. It's a unified court system from the bottom up, with these 3 courts having the most power. And right now, these appellate courts in Pennsylvania are the ones that the legislature is looking at for potential change. So I'm going to turn that over to Jamie now, who's going to talk to us a little more about exactly what it is the Pennsylvania legislature is looking at. I think we need to have you muted, Jamie.
Here I am, Zoom world that we're living in. Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk actually about what is a constitutional amendment. So we've heard about the courts and the setup. We are going to talk about HB 38, the particular proposed constitutional amendment, the bill. But before we do that, let me just give you an overview. See a bit of my email. And I'm just going to talk quickly about what is a constitutional amendment. Some of you, hopefully, you go vote. We have elections every year, twice a year. But I wanted to talk about what is a constitutional amendment. And that is a bill that's proposed by the House or the Senate through the usual means, comes out of committee. In this case, HB 38, dealing with the judiciary, will come out of the Judicial Committee. And then it's passed, as it usually would be, by the House or the Senate, so it's both chambers, and it must be passed by a simple majority in each of those chambers. And what's also very important, that it has to be done not just once, but twice, and it must be in consecutive legislative sessions that same bill is passed by a simple majority in each of the chambers. And this one just came up in the news. So I'm going to give you some examples about this process. Notice, this is all, everything I'm talking about here comes from our PA state constitution about the process for constitutional amendments. So notice by the DOS, that's the Department of State, and they must advertise in newspapers in every county. So after that first session where the bill is passed by a simple majority of both chambers, it must be published 3 months before the general election. Now, after it's passed the second time, it has to be advertised again in the same method in the newspapers in every county at least 3 months before whichever election it appears, whether that's the primary or the general election. So yes, constitutional amendments can appear both on the primary ballot as well as the general election ballot. And then it's up to us, right? Whether we as voters approve of the ballot question. Very important that although we are a closed primary state, as Roberta mentioned, that all voters, whether you're affiliated with a major party or not, can vote on these ballot questions, as we are all residents. So if you're a registered voter, you can all vote on these constitutional ballot questions. Very important also, there's no veto as generally a bill would have when it's passed through the legislature. There is no veto power by the governor. So that's kind of laying out how PA constitutional amendments happen. I've gotten a lot of questions about the question itself. You know, how does this question get on the ballot? For instance, we just heard about the retirement age, 75, of judges. That was a ballot question. Many people till this day, when I present about these issues, still tell me that it was very confusing to them. That is the Attorney General, which drafts that out. And then there's also plain language. I encourage all of you. You can look this up. It hasn't, it will be on the Department of State website. It'll be in a newspaper, but also if you vote in person, you at your polling location, they will have your Judge of Elections, which runs your polling location, will have all of that information about the plain language so that you can better understand if you find the shorter version of the question about yes or no quite confusing. And then it's also important that no amendment, no proposed amendment or amendments shall be submitted more than once in 5 years. And then this is this last issue here. This came up recently with Marcy's Law. Many of you may remember or maybe have voted. This was the victims' rights. Well, of course, I would hope anybody who was asked, do you support victims' rights, would say emphatically yes. But that was to amend our Constitution, but it included several amendments log rolled, meaning accumulated all into one. And that is actually unconstitutional. So the League of Women Voters was part of was plaintiff in a case to challenge that amendment. So although it went to the ballot, we successfully challenged that. It was recently upheld. So that's why these courts are so significant that we will talk about today. So that's how the constitutional amendments happen. But now we're going to talk about a specific constitutional amendment. And we're going to talk about a particular one that's been proposed. And I'm going to welcome Tuan, and we're going to start to talk about HB 38, which means House Bill. So when you hear HB or SB, that is Senate bill or House bill that has been proposed. And I should note, people ask me this, will it be on the May ballot? Right now, it does not appear that it will be on the May primary ballot, but I want to encourage all of you who are listening today that through that timeline that I discussed, it still could be passed through that second, it's already been passed before, so it can go through that second consecutive session. And so it could still possibly be on our November ballot. So it's a good time to be, and I thank you so much everybody for being here to learn about it, because it's very important that we discuss why it's so significant, why it could be so dangerous. And so Tuan, I don't know if you want to explain what the bill is, or if you want me to go ahead, but I'm going to welcome you in, because now we're going to get kind of more into the nitty-gritty of what this means about this bill.
Thank you, Jamie. And maybe to begin, let's talk about some of the features of HB 38 and what it proposes. One curiosity that I had, Jamie, was that it seems like if we were to move from what we currently have, which is statewide elections, where you have a very broad talent pool, where you potentially have every lawyer in the land as a candidate, that you know, we would be moving to smaller talent pools under a districting proposal. Why do that?
Yeah, so right away you're getting to the point of what HB 38 would be proposing, and that's for our top 3 courts. As Roberta mentioned, our top 3 courts are the appellate courts. They're elected statewide. And now what's being proposed is to draw regional districts. So instead of the statewide voters voting for a statewide position, it would now be this smaller pool, which this visual, I agree with Roberta, visuals help. And so we would only be picking from a small pool, and each of the respective justices would be running, they must be a resident of this district in which they are running for at least a year. And then they would have to be voted on only by the residents of that particular region. So right off the bat, I think anybody could see without or understand, even without a visual, that you go from this larger pool of a statewide, and now you're limited down to these respective regions. And certainly you do not have the type of diversity that I think we would see or we need, especially for courts that are deciding statewide and, you know, evaluating our state constitution.
So now, Jamie, in talking about this districting, this is a partisan constitutional amendment. I believe it was supported by 29 Republicans and 1 independent joining the Republicans, but there were no Democrats on this. And, you know, we can think about this in 2 senses. We can think about the districts being drawn in ways to eliminate certain people from ever becoming judges, but we can also think about it from the perspective of eliminating certain voters that we don't want to participate in the elections. So I just want to put up a graphic here to try to illustrate my point. So here, what we've got is the distribution of Pennsylvania's population generally. So this is from US Census data. So this is where people live in Pennsylvania. And then using the census data tool, you can select where different groups of populations live. And if we take a look at what's happening here, we can see where groups of Black or African-American populations live in Pennsylvania, for example. You can see that there is a pronounced pattern of people living in the major urban areas in and around Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and Pittsburgh. You know, also some people in Allentown and Scranton. But then also, this is also the case for Asian American populations. We could go through all the various different groups. Now, if we take Pennsylvania's population and divide it by 7, because we're told we're going to create 7 different districts for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and suppose you are a motivated partisan, Jamie, how are you going to draw those districts?
Well, this gets right to what we know has already been done in Pennsylvania. So you hit the nail on the head when you said, how would I draw it? Well, if I was the party in power in the legislature and I wanted to keep my party in power, which many of you might have heard the term gerrymandering, you know, that is where the party in power draws the maps, usually for legislative or congressional districts, but in this case, it would be judicial. I would make sure that I would draw it to keep my party in power, including here, since we have partisan judicial elections. I would make sure, depending on whichever party I was, because I want to note here, both parties gerrymander. But in this case, yes, it was proposed by the PA GOP, the Republicans. And so if I was drawing it, I would make sure to keep all those rural areas. That's this idea, what we call in gerrymandering, you know, this idea of packing and cracking. So I would look at the areas around southeastern PA, out toward Allegheny County, where there is a concentration, and I would make sure to crack them to make sure that I could keep my party in power and in the end, have a determinate outcome, whether people vote or not.
Yeah, and I'll note that I think that the districting division, if you take the population of Pennsylvania, which is about 12.8 million souls, and we were to divide that into 7, you're looking at districts of about 1.8 million. At least Philadelphia County has about 1.5 million. So you could see that being roped off as a potential district. And that might be a way to sort of minimize the influence of Philadelphia voters, if you will, because currently, isn't it the case that Philadelphians and folks from Pittsburgh and Harrisburg get to vote for all 7 seats on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court?
Well, yes and no. This is something, I think many, right, we have many leaguers who are joining us. A lot of us have been working to talk to our legislators to find out, why would you support a bill like this? And certainly that's something that comes up, right? That they'll actually in return say back, well, we need more diversity on the court, more geographic diversity. And yes, while it's true that you have justices from certain areas, I would say after you really look and those are the population centers, so it's really not. That's where the most population is in Pennsylvania, so it's not rocket science, right? But yes, so these are the maps that came with the actual bill that was proposed. And I would note, though, that after investigation, you really see that the judges, the justices that are on the court, while they may currently reside in those greater population areas of Philadelphia region, southeastern PA, and Allegheny County near Pittsburgh, they actually grew up all over Pennsylvania, or maybe went to law school in one of these regions. As we know, the law schools tend to be around urban areas or where we have a greater concentration of population. So this idea of geographic diversity could be a bit of a red herring.
And in talking a little bit about this idea of gerrymandering and the possibility of having smaller districts, does that mean that we're going to have, I guess, less money in politics? Will races cost less because we've got smaller districts?
Again, you're getting right to the point. I appreciate it. These are really good questions, and I'm going to ask you questions too. But I really want to encourage people, when people say to me, well, why is this so dangerous? Why do you tell me that we need to save our courts? Because I get very passionate about it. And I tell them it's really not one thing. It's a conglomerate of many issues that we are facing in Pennsylvania. So first, that we already have partisan elections. I think you and I am going to talk to you about what are some alternatives to electing judges. And then you put in the fact that we have very little, if any, state campaign finance laws. So money in politics, this idea of dark money, millions and millions of dollars comes in, even from outside our state, to fund these elections. And then you have gerrymandering, drawing the maps, which happens every 10 years and is coming up. So we already have drawn district lines, and this was challenged to the court. So we know it's a target. This bill was proposed because it was a reaction to the frustration, that's me putting it in kind words, the frustration that the courts decided the maps that were drawn previously were unconstitutional under our Pennsylvania Constitution. And I want to stress to you that the makeup of our current court is in opposition to the party that is proposing this bill. So right now we have the Democratic court, and our maps are coming up, and that fifth person, there's a 5-member commission that draws our maps. The fifth person comes from the courts. And right now, that means the Democrats would have certain power to do that. So they're kind of all linked together. And I tell people it's very scary. I mean, there's a lot more reasons why it's scary, but there's a lot of money in politics. There's a lot of things that we need to address here to unrig our system. And they go hand in hand. And this is just another example. But I guess I should ask you, because there's even more significance here of what are some of the dangers beyond this idea of partisan elections?
Well, I think we could think of judicial independence ultimately as being at risk here. And we can think of judicial independence along 2 different dimensions. So one could be independence from another branch of government, so namely the legislature. So there is concern that given the current Constitution, the way the Supreme Court is currently constituted, that there is provided for in HB 38 authority given to the legislature to decide how to handle the transition from what we have right now to what we will have in the future. And so including deciding whether people who are current incumbent justices must say relocate to a different district within the state in order to continue to hold office. And so the devil is in the details, but HB 38 is very short on those details. It effectively commits that power to the legislature. And so we might worry that in fact, what is going on is an effort to deselect current incumbent justices from the court, because we have granted to, if enacted, the amendment would permit the political partisan majority to be able to make changes that would effectively deselect. And I think it's worth mentioning right now that there's a little bit of a background story. So maybe let me throw this back at you, Jamie.
Yeah.
You know, what is that background story here? We've got Justice David Wecht here. How do Republicans feel about him?
Well, I should ask you, because I should throw that back at you. Threw that at me, but there is a backstory here about how HB 38 came about. But it's not just him, right? It's another justice, maybe on a different appellate court. But yeah, no, you tell me, because I've seen your slideshow.
Yeah, well, so, you know, Justice David Wecht, in doing his job as a jurist on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, he was in the voting majority on several important cases that sort of gored the partisan ox of Republicans. And so there was an effort launched afoot to actually impeach on the basis of his work product, not any, not any treason, bribery, high crimes, misdemeanors at the federal standard, or the, anything that was criminal or untoward. There was some accusation that he was biased and therefore should have been recused from these matters. But the idea is that, look, we could target Justice David Wecht if we get this constitutional amendment, because we
Right,
get
and then
this.
also, what party is he from? I think you need to emphasize that.
Well, so he is, I believe, a Democrat, but he has been a, I have heard Justice David Wecht speak to conservative groups, so he's not an ideologue, rank partisan. I don't have any sense. He spoke to the Philadelphia chapter of the Federalist Society, a group of conservative and libertarian lawyers, and I think was well respected and received by some of the people there, but obviously not all. And so HB 38 is in a sense a instrument potentially, and I would say very likely potentially, to deselect and change the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
Now, I just want to go back and emphasize that to everybody, what you said, that in the bill as it currently states now, it's more what is being said, but also what is not being written out. While it tells us that there will be judicial districts drawn, and I should note also that is not able to be vetoed by the governor. So there's no checks on that. And it also is missing any language about replacing justices. So just as Tuan said here, what is going to happen to the three branch, those three courts, the three highest courts? It is essentially wiping the slate clean and, for lack of better words, hijacking, right? Because they can essentially put in and predetermine the outcome. Now, I say they being, because it's really whichever party is in power. In this case, it happens to be the Republicans, but it could be, in the future, it could be a different party. So it's important to remember that this very much unsettles the separation of powers. So I wanted to ask you about that, Tuan, because we're talking about these balancing and separation and the decisions that are being made. Couldn't it be said, though, that this maybe evens the score? I mean, that's something that I've been told by some legislators who are supporting this, that this actually is more of a checks on our judicial branch.
Right. So, let me back up and say that, we've been talking so far about one dimension out of two dimensions of independence. And so in speaking about independence from the legislative branch, it's maybe important to talk institutionally about what it is the judiciary is supposed to do. And so the ideal in American law, at least, is that the judiciary is applying law to fact. And so the idea is that that partisan identification and ideology ought not to matter. So we have statutes that have been enacted duly by the legislature. We have case law precedent. And so issues that come before the court should be determined as a matter of law rather than partisan identification. Now, I think most Americans in the American Legal Academy now self-identify as what we'll call American legal realists, in that we don't believe that law and fact solely determines cases, that at the margins, for a certain set of cases at least, the law may be underdetermined and that the identity of the adjudicator does in fact matter. But it's also important to say that these adjudicators, who are the incumbents who would be affected, they were elected in statewide races that are competitive, in the sense that there was no gerrymandering, everyone had their say, and elections, yes, have consequences. Something we do know about, in contrast, is that if you put a constitutional amendment in front of people and you ask them whether to amend the Constitution or not, that people will vote yes, no matter what, because that's our instinct. And so the concern is that this might not be as considered a choice as say, would you like to vote R or would you like to vote D? Having a ballot amendment put before you, people are inclined to vote yes. And so yes, there is a political check already in place. It's called the election of jurists in competitive races where you have an R and a D. Also, this ideal of American law that we are governed by laws and not the identity of adjudicators in the first place, while acknowledging that yes, at the margins, identity of adjudicator matters. But then this behavioral oddity that we like to amend the Constitution and have changes when it's put before us, and there's no alternative that is given to us of, say, some other method of, say, amending the Constitution on this very same subject. So
I just want to take that one step further, though. Right now, we do have elections. We have partisan elections, as was discussed. So in a way, our courts are politicized, but maybe we should be discussing it for anybody who's thinking about this. Well, we already elect judges. Wasn't this kind of the same thing? So maybe we need to explain, why this would politicize the process even further and really undermine the trust in our judiciary. Maybe you could just take that one step further.
Right. So maybe we need to talk a little bit about gerrymandering here when we talk about gerrymandering. So when you gerrymander districts, the idea is to try to maximize the number of districts that are going to break your way and minimize the number of districts that are going to break your opponent's way. And we use these tools, as you say, creating either packing or cracking. So we want to, in order to advance that goal of maximization of our own and trying to minorize the other side. One critique of gerrymandering is that in democracy, usually we think of voters as choosing their officials, but with gerrymandering, what we have is officials choosing their voters. And so what ends up happening is we begin to get polarization because, again, districts, and I should say that this is contested, their political scientists debate, how much polarization actually results from this. My view of the issue is that it does worsen polarization, and that in addition, what it does is it introduces an element of parochialism, especially when we're moving from statewide races to districted races. And this can raise the second dimension of independence that we worry about. It's not the independence of the judiciary from the legislature, but the independence of the judiciary from parties that come before the judiciary, and especially when those parties are important actors in the political process who are well-heeled. Some of you may be familiar with the infamous State Farm litigation out of state, thankfully on this one, Illinois, and the idea of State Farm secretively pouring all this money, all these resources, dark money, into a particular judicial race in order to then get the judges that were elected by virtue of all of this dark money, to get those judges to effectively, in what was quid pro quo type of corruption, to get them to vacate $1 billion judgment that was against State Farm. And so what you worry about then is that it becomes deliciously tantalizing for interest groups to step in and pick off districts to pour money into particular seats when they believe that they can affect the outcome of cases that are already pending. And so, again, this raises a concern about impartiality.
Well, you bring up Illinois. I've been asked, well, are there other states that do this? Illinois is an example. Now, even with that example you gave of Illinois, there's, I think, only 2 other states that do this. It would not be as extreme as what has been proposed here in Pennsylvania, where there's absolutely no veto power, and that you would also have judges, they would end up being politicians. I'm only answering not to the state, which should be, for which I'm making decisions statewide. I'm only answering to my region, my district of constituents. And again, you compound that with very little campaign finance, all that dark money that you talked about, and this already existing polarization in our state. And then I should note also, it's very important that we have closed primaries. So the largest group of new registered voters in Pennsylvania are unaffiliated voters. And I should say, I always note, we're doing a university talk. It's very important that the largest block of Pennsylvania voters are 18 to 35-year-olds. So it's incredibly empowering. But if you're an unaffiliated voter and you are not able to participate in what already is a closed primary, that's another concern here. And people already are feeling polarized in the current political climate that we're in. I think people need to feel that they can have trust in the judiciary, that the judge that they're going before will be independent. This further undermines what I feel people are already feeling, which is this distrust of people in power. And it's not surprising, right? Because here they're proposing a bill that they want us to approve, right? It's all packaged nicely. And, oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah, why wouldn't we split everything up and have judges from all over the state? So on the surface, it could seem very, as simple and, but really quite dangerous and nefarious in its intent.
So, Jamie, we've talked about these threats both to independence from other branches of government, as well as independence from the parties that are going to appear in front of the court. What about statewide accountability? Because one of the worst aspects, I think, of our system of judicial election is that retention races are not terrific tools. I think 98% of incumbents get retained when we do have a retention race. And so it has the form of political accountability without the reality of it, unless you believe that 98% of the time we're perfectly content with our judicial incumbents. It's just that we don't have adequate ventilation of the issues because it's, the devil you know versus the devil you don't. How could I ever hold accountable a jurist from a far-flung corner of the state for an ill-devised judicial opinion?
Well, the way that you phrase it, well, in this context, you wouldn't really be able to. Now, the other side of that is, so I'll play devil's advocate, that you should know the people, the region that you're from, that there is a sense of accountability when you're local to an area, that people understand and connect with you as somebody who is local and identifiable. That's the reverse side of it. I hope I gave that justice. But the other side of that is, this false sense of understanding the bigger picture of just how dangerous this is, because judges are not to be held accountable to only a fraction or really to be held accountable as politicians. I think I noted that because they are to be independent, impartial. Right now, yes, we do have partisan elections, but overall, and this is something that we have judicial screening committees, and that the Bar Association looks at these candidates and says, is this somebody who will be on the bench that has a good temperament, that is impartial, something personally, right? Because this is something that you've been through. But I think it gets to the bigger picture of accountability isn't something necessarily that a judge should have to constituents. That's essentially what the regions will be, that it will be constituents. And it certainly does not help balance the power. We talked about population, and you showed us that the chart of the population, you actually lose power in the concentrated areas. If you put together Philadelphia, despite being the largest city in Pennsylvania, they would be concentrated and only have one judge. So you take away this so-called accountability. I think we have to be careful about saying certain terms as they don't apply in this situation. But I really want to because we're getting already to like almost 7:50.
We should take I think questions.
Wait, well, I want to ask you, because we haven't talked about what are some of the alternatives. At the League, we've been working for decades, the League of Women Voters and other groups, especially Pennsylvanians for Modern Courts, to talk about what are the alternatives. If we're one of few states that still elects judges, what are the other states doing? So maybe you could just say, what are the alternatives? And so that viewers understand that there is an option that does not make this process so politicized.
Sure. Well, we could mention that at the time of the founding in the state courts, that 85% of the population of the United States was in a jurisdiction that selected judges by some type of appointive gubernatorial nominations and state upper chamber advice and consent. Right? So that was the norm. And so judicial election doesn't come onto the scene until later in American history. Curiously enough, laying the ground for this is the Jacksonian Democratic era. But in the late 1820s into the 1830s, you had this populist rage where there was all this worry about hidden puppeteers that, and worry about elites. In fact, there was an anti-Masonic party. So, imagine that, populist and conspiracy theories. And they said, we need to get away from this appointed system. We need to have elections, and, we need to have greater sort of control over the judiciary and not have these be appointed. And so what we end up getting is during a period where there's a rash of state constitutional revisions, many states then move to this idea of judicial election, which we're kind of stuck with. But as you're correct, it's not, history shows it's not the only way we've ever had to select judges. Delaware has a very well-respected judiciary. And Delaware has a method that Matt has both political accountability as well as input on expertise. And so you could have, again, a mini federal model of, executive nomination with Senate advice and consent, with some kind of adjunct group of experts that help vet and make sure that people aren't just political cronies and apparatchiks getting paid at patronage, but are instead well-qualified ethical people. A popular form of selection is out of Missouri, which is sort of I don't love it, but it is maybe better than what we have. It's called the Missouri Plan. And so, a Missouri Plan has a blue ribbon commission of very often lawyers selected by, and the devil's in the details and how these are put together, but roughly a certain number of people selected by the legislature, a certain number of people selected by the courts, and and by the executive branch, right? So some combination is roughly what the Missouri plan looks like. And they come up with a slate of nominees and they say, okay, governor, pick one of these three. And then the governor has the choice to select one of those. And then some modifications of this system, the governor can say, hey, I don't like any of these people, and can flush the list and say, go back and come up with a new list for me of 3 well-qualified people. And then the governor, is stuck with that second slate. And if it doesn't choose someone from that slate, then the vacancy will go unfilled. And so, but in the event someone is selected, that person doesn't forever become a judge. The person becomes subject to a retention election at the next regular election. And so that is kind of the midway point between, a fully merit selection process versus an electoral process. It's sort of a hybrid system. Or you could have something like Nevada, right? So Nevada says we're going to have a nonpartisan election. So we're going to take the parties out of it. We don't like the fact that party bosses can control who gets the nomination. That might tend to benefit the status quo, harm women and minorities who have not traditionally been in power in the 2 major political parties. That would be yet another alternative. Look, there are many variations on this. America has 50 laboratories of experimentation on this question. Very few have settled on Pennsylvania's model.
Yeah, well, I will say our Supreme Court, there is not one person of color.
That's right. But to the credit, I think, of Pennsylvania, there are many women jurists, both at the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and on our intermediate courts, which is significant. And go look at the demographics. Where do active status women lawyers live in the Commonwealth? Well, the NALP data and the Bureau of Labor Statistics will tell you in and around Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and Pittsburgh, which, by the way, is also where people of color who are lawyers generally live. And so, look, if we can rope off certain districts and make it less likely those individuals could ever become judges, maybe then the HB 38 could be viewed for what it is, something that purports to be on its face neutral with respect to race and sex, but in fact is actually maybe a Trojan horse. And so again, let's call it like we see it. HB 38 parades under a rationale of diversity of soil, but our government doesn't elect people on the basis of soil, it's on the basis of votes. And we're trying to take away people's right to vote for most of the seats.
Yeah.
Maybe we should open this up for questions.
Yeah,
Jamie.
no, we can keep going and going. But I do want to say to people, although we're talking about HB 38, I don't want you to forget that we still do elect judges and that we do have judicial elections coming up in May that include our top 3 courts, as well as maybe, I know near me, I'm in Montgomery County, we have a Court of Common Pleas seat open, as well as magisterial district judges. So till we can actually change the system, I still encourage you, please, to make sure that you're aware that we do have local and judicial races coming up.
On the note of democratic involvement, then I think questions are a good thing to bring into the conversation right now. We had questions that were submitted while people registered, and we've also had a few more come in through the chat. If anybody has a question that they'd like to submit, you can send that, I think, directly to me, or if you're having trouble with that, you can send it to Alexis Jankowski and she'll forward it to me. If we could kick off, you mentioned alternatives to electing judges and appointing judges, and I think really made it clear that it's not an either or choice, that there's an interaction between the two, and there's a lot of different varieties out there. Could you talk, though, about how one or the other of those, or some version of the courts can maintain this idea of checks and balances in government, federal and state? One of the questions says, in particular, when one of the parties seems intent on destroying it. Now, whether you want to weigh in on that side or not, we heard that there is partisanship and gerrymandering that happens on both sides. What, in the view of the panelists, is the best way to maintain this integrity going forward?
Well, that's a big one. I'll start, but Tuan, you follow up. I would say it's not just about our courts. This amendment that's been proposed, I believe, is a microcosm of a much bigger issue, that there are a lot of things that we need to do to make sure no party has power and control to predetermine our votes and the outcome, whether that's to put justices on the court or to draw lines to make sure judicial, legislative, or congressional outcomes are predetermined. And then I think also it goes hand in hand with alternatives to our closed primary system. That's again another thing that the League and other good government groups, and we've seen it work in other states through ranked choice voting, which is, we won't go into that, but if you look at other states like Alaska just passed something, but in turn, they've also passed really true campaign finance law. We talked about getting that dark money out of politics. So in a sense, the parties wield almost like a big corporation. They wield tremendous power to determine outcomes and to really, in a sense, well, as that person, they said one party wields power, but we've seen it happen from both sides of the aisle.
So I'm going to say, I'm going to quote Madison here, James Madison, who was addressing this question of how to preserve checks and balances if a party is dedicated to destroying it. So his comments come from the Virginia ratifying convention. And he said that, I go on this great Republican principle that the people will have virtue and intelligence to select, in his era he used men, but people of virtue and wisdom. And Madison said, is there no virtue among us? If there be not, we're in a wretched situation. He then might be sounding pessimistic here. He says, no theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure. To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. And I think that's where civic education comes in, and inculcation of public virtue, the idea that there is a common good, that we're not going to pursue atomistic individual ends to the extreme. That is what I understand to be virtue, and groups like the League of Women Voters are important in this way, in that they help inculcate virtue. And so it's very fitting that Roberta Winters is a former elementary school teacher, because sometimes I feel like if our politicians could only go back to kindergarten and learn that, we don't hit and we share, that maybe we would be a better country for it. So again, how do we preserve checks and balances in government? Well, I think we need virtue. I don't think any system of government could be devised to sort of save us otherwise. It can maybe slow the decay, but at the end of the day, I think virtue is important.
Okay, that would have been a great note to end on, but I think we need to lead to action as well. So I'm gonna, because we're right at the end of our time, I'm gonna mention a couple questions and then put one final kind of group of a theme of questions to the two of you. So we had a lot of people asking about the implications that this bill would have for different demographics, different groups of people. One person was asking about students. One person was asking about people who suffer mental health disabilities or issues from mental health issues. Another one was asking about homelessness. I think we don't have time necessarily to unpack all that right now, but I encourage people to look into the details on how court decisions do affect this, and how having statewide representation rather than local representation could affect that. Instead, to the two of you, I hope we could end on action. The League of Women Voters, I don't think Roberta would let me go without you saying like, what's going to happen with the election? What are we supposed to do? So we've had questions asking, can you just recap? When is this coming up, or when are there other things that are supposed to be paid attention to? Since people are already voting statewide for top level judges, how do we find out about those candidates? How do we find about their qualifications or viewpoints? How do we get more information about the judgeships? And then a last question here. What kind of advocacy activities should we be engaged in? Where can we, beyond just the voting booth, what can we do to get involved in this activity? And we'll end with that
Should
cluster
I
question.
take it away about the league? Okay, she's nodding. Well, I think first something Tuan mentioned is really important, which is just talking about civics, talking about what you learned tonight. Like, hey, I heard about this crazy thing that they want to do, right? Talking to your friends, talking to your neighbors. Most people aren't even aware that we elect judges in Pennsylvania, right? So just encouraging your friends, your family, to make sure that they know that there's elections every year, twice a year. And how can they learn that information? Well, there's great resources. The league has vote411.org. And you can also join your local league. Now, this is nonpartisan information where we list everything from your school board to the mayor, if you live in a borough or a city of a mayor, and then also the judicial candidates. I will say also the particular county bar associations and the state bar associations, as well as the respective political parties, also have their own endorsement conventions and screening committees. So that's a way you can find out all of that if you did want to find particular partisan information. But I think also, what can you do? Well, beyond just talking, you can really get involved with certain civic groups. I know with the league, we do legislative interviews. So we encourage you to go speak to your representative just about HB 38, right? Sending it, and then we get that information, and then we advocate at a state level. And then we also bring different lawsuits if it needs to come to that. So it's a league for a reason, and it's for men and women, even though it is 101 years old. It started with the 19th Amendment, but that too is all about expanding. When the 19th Amendment was ratified, it didn't include all women to vote. So it's really about getting involved. I would encourage also groups like the NAACP, local and state chapter, I'm also a part of. I know some people on here have joined. And then also just whether that's your civic association locally, that's really important just to talk about local government and how things work. And if you notice something's wrong, I would say get involved. But students, I think they're everything. They're the future. Young people, as I said, 18 to 35, they're the largest voting bloc. You hold tremendous power. Yes. And I think they just need to be told that. So everything that I do is really geared toward empowering young people. So talk to your friends, talk to your peers, make sure they're registered to vote. You can register right now. Go to votespa.com. As long as you're 18 by election day, US citizen, resident of Pennsylvania, we do have options. You can vote by mail. These are all things you can find at votespa.com, but also that vote411.org will link you to finding your polling location or how to vote by mail, as well as about different candidates. But there's a lot to be done. Some people do particularly like to do, thank you, Ray, for putting the links to that. But there is plenty. It's really just up to you how much you want to do.
And I'll note here that that although the sponsorship on HB 38 was starkly partisan, that there are many Republicans who have serious reservations about HB 38 and have joined with Democrats in expressing their concern about this, that they too worry about what will happen about extending the hyperpolarization further in the judiciary. So if your representative happens to be Republican, don't write them off as not willing to listen to you. I would write to your assembly, General Assembly members, whether in the House or the Senate, and let them know that, look, I'm concerned about this.
Yes, and I should mention also Fair Districts PA. It's a big one, I forgot, which is a project of the League of Women Voters. And there's a great tool on fairdistrictspa.com, which allows you to look up your legislator and to see whether they support redistricting reform. as well as whether they are for or against HB 38. You can even see what they voted for. So as Tuan mentioned, there are Republicans who previously, in that first time that HB 38 went through the House and the Senate, voted for passing such a bill, have indicated either they're not going to or didn't support it as part of that Judiciary committee to pass it out of the committee. So we are making headway, and I want people to know your voice matters, and that we have to make sure to hold our representatives accountable, because certainly they're called representatives. They're supposed to represent us. But Fair Districts PA, great resource. There's also ways you can get involved in there on action items, whether it's letters to the editor. But young people, again, I just keep going back to it, and they do tend to register as unaffiliated independents in Pennsylvania. So again, they're closed out from primaries, even though they're taxpayers who help to administer, pay to administer elections. But usually these ballot questions or elections generally are happening in the primary because of closed primaries. So how does it impact students? Well, there's a long line of reasons, but really this is also a great impact on people of color and low income populations. But I won't go on and on, just get involved.
I think that's a decent, that's an ending befitting the League of Women Voters, I think. Civic virtue, but also become civically informed and find ways to become empowered. That civic empowerment is the way to move ahead. Roberta, any final comments from you?
Yes, I would also say transparency is the great antidote for a lot of problems. And we are very lucky because you can watch all your local government meetings, you can watch all your county government meetings, you can go on the Pennsylvania legislature and watch all their meetings. And it's really important to get a sense of what's going on. So be aware that all of these meetings are transparent, and we fight to make them stay that way.
All right, so stay vigilant, pay attention. I think this night was organized in the midst of hearing that this was being rushed through, that HB 38 was just rolling along. It seems like the brakes have been pumped a little bit, but I'm hearing from Jamie and Tuan, there's still chances that this is going to be off to the races again. So
it could be potentially with that time frame I noted for passing a constitutional amendment. It could very well likely be on the November ballot. Oh, very important. There will be a constitutional ballot question on the primary ballot. Very important. Although it's not what we're discussing tonight, SB 2, Senate Bill 2, is about limitations on the executive powers of the governor. So we're talking about limitations of power and checks and balances. And then also there will be a separate question about protections, racial discrimination protections. So I would say a yay and a nay, a reverse, sorry, no and yes. But again, that will all be available. That language will be available on vote411.org.
But to be clear, HB 38 has not reached to the point where it's going to be a ballot measure for the amendment. So stay tuned. That may change, but at this point, redistricting is not going to be up for a vote at this point. Stay tuned. If we turn that corner, watch this space for more news. In the meantime, thank you so much for spending this snowy Friday night with us. We appreciate you taking the time to learn more about this. Please make sure whatever you've got here, you spread it out to your friends, your family, your neighbors, put it up on social media. You can find a recording of this session shortly by the end of the week, or at the very latest, the start of next week on our YouTube channel, which I posted up in the chat, and I'll put again here at the end. But thanks again. Please join me in thanking Jamie Mogul, Tuan Samahon, and Roberta for being the captain of our ship here. Thank you all for being here, and have a wonderful night.
And thanks to you, Ray, and Brian, and Alexis from Cabrini. Thank you so much.
Yes, huge shout out to Alexis, who's making this whole thing work.
Shout out to Cabrini for making the ask.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us. And Dr. Ward, I'm happy to stay on if it looked like there was a question or two, if there.
Yeah, we got.
That's wonderful. Great. Yeah. So if you're able to stick
about
around.
district magisterial judges. Yeah. That is something I always talk about with people. Somebody wrote here that you do not need any legal expertise or even a legal license or a law degree. That is correct. That is part of our state constitution. That is not required of a magisterial district judge. They do hear things beyond traffic tickets, so it's something to be considered. You know, they even do discovery. They have party matters, low-level felony offenses. So yes, you actually need more hours in training to become a massage therapist than you do to be a magisterial district judge. So another thing we could
Which is
really
not
work
to disparage massage therapists. But
I'm not. I am very grateful that there's licensing, but I think people should know where these inequities lie.
I have a funny anecdote to add here. I had, before the pandemic, a group of students over for dinner, and I had one student who was there who was a little bit sheepish. He was a third-year law student at the time. And someone says, "Hey, tell Professor Samahon your news." This is someone who has not yet graduated from law school. He had just been elected a district magistrate.
I love it.
And I said, "Well, I guess I'm going to have to start treating you with some deference, Your Honor." And but that is an odd and curious wrinkle of Pennsylvania law.
PA is a strange breed, but I will say we are very lucky that we do have a very expansive and liberal state constitution in many ways. It says that we all have the right to clean air, clean water. That case that was before the Supreme Court about our about our congressional districts really was because, and we're the only state in which that challenge was brought successfully because of the language in our state constitution. And then look at the outcome, right? So the maps were redrawn and it did balance and reflect, 9 and 9, really the outcome of what Pennsylvania looks like politically. But again, there's good and bad to the PA Constitution. But everybody should be on alert for sure about election laws and changes that are, as I said, I say to people, you need to have eyes in the back of your head when it comes to PA politics.